I always thought it's hard to make new friends, but making enemies, I guess that's easy.
In 2014, Supergiant Games released their second game, Transistor. This ARPG has plenty in common with their previous game, Bastion. There are some similarities in gameplay, theme, and of course, there's the iconic voice work of Logan Cunningham. At the same time, Transistor sets itself apart with some unique mechanics and an enigmatic story. The game's premise is that you're a singer named Red whose voice has been stolen by a criminal organization. During the attack, they unwittingly left behind the titular Transistor, a glowy talking cyberpunk sword that can be upgraded with new abilities as you advance through the game. Besides boasting beautiful art by Gen Z that offers a fresh spin on Art Nouveau, alongside an unforgettable story, Transistor has particularly creative gameplay that could reframe the way that you think about the action role-playing game. On this episode of Other Games Can Learn From, we'll be talking about how Transistor grants a sense of deliberacy and weight to player actions, how it manages risk and reward to keep gameplay engaging, how it gives players room to breathe with quiet moments that serve both the game's story as well as its overall pace, and how it conveys its themes.
We're not gonna get away with this, are we?
Deliberate action. In most games, players take thousands of actions. Running, jumping, blowing up killer robots from the future. Transistor is no exception to the rule. There are definitely robots to blow up, but thanks to the game's design decisions, these robots are blown up with vision and purpose and nuance. Okay, perhaps that's a bit of a stretch, but Transistor doesn't start until the player takes an action. Really, takes an action. The game begins when protagonist Red pulls the titular Transistor from her bodyguard. From there, everything else unfolds. Each action in the game has a sense of finality, in line with the game's theme. In the city, for example, Red can stop and stare at a poster of herself. Once she turns around, the player is never again offered the opportunity to stop and gaze. This ties into the game's sense of pacing and theme, as well as the way that it gives the player room to breathe and contemplate the story. That's something that we'll be talking about a little later. Behind every action is a sense of purpose. Red, stopping to look at the poster of herself, imparts some information about her as a character, a now silent protagonist who's now reminiscing about who she was, and perhaps contemplating what she'll become. At least, that's what I got out of it. The interesting thing about the scene with the poster is that you can choose how long to stare at it and ultimately what it means to you. The scene could have been a carefully timed in-game cinematic, but by granting players this little bit of agency to turn around when they want, they decide for themselves what this poster means to their idea of Red. To be clear, Red is a very specific character who takes deliberate actions. Transistor isn't full of complex moral questions, but to you, the player, the way that you execute certain actions offers a degree of agency, an opportunity to express yourself within the game. One of the arguments foolishly lobbied against the notion of video games as art is the idea that because players have agency, they can't experience a game in the same way that one might experience a painting or film. Personally, I find this idea narrow-minded, but that's just my personal opinion. If you walk through the Louvre with your nose in your cell phone the whole time, the Mona Lisa doesn't cease to exist as art. Just because you don't experience a game in the way that its designers may have intended doesn't change what the game is. It only changes what the game means to you. Transistor offers a fantastic counterpoint to the notion that art needs to be experienced in one way, because while the game itself is relatively linear, it's in those moments of deliberacy, those moments in which your actions are final, that Transistor shows that video games can offer a very specific experience, idea, or feeling while maintaining a meaningful degree of player agency. Pinning down just what makes actions in Transistor feel purposeful can be tricky. This is because the sense of meaning is not the result of any one design decision. Rather, it's story and aesthetic elements coming together with gameplay. To narrow it down, however, it's irreversible actions coupled with story beats and a little bit of player agency. To go back to the example of the poster, you can walk away from it at any time. In fact, your bodyguard turned cybersword urges you to keep moving forward. But when you actually look away, it's because you decided to, though if you do wait long enough, eventually an enemy does show up. In terms of actual gameplay, Transistor's sense of deliberacy is conveyed through the way that the titular sword is upgraded. Nothing you do to your sword is really permanent. The game invites you to experiment with different upgrade paths by unlocking different bits of story through different combinations of abilities. So then, how does this system invite players to take deliberate actions? Well, you can't upgrade your sword willy-nilly. The different abilities have different costs, and whatever decision you make regarding your upgrade path, you're stuck with it until you reach another access point. If you're running into a boss encounter and you don't like the way that your Transistor works, well, that's too bad. Probably the best way that Transistor pushes players to make meaningful decisions is during the core gameplay. See, at first glance, Transistor seems like a more normal ARPG. You run around, smash robots, and keep moving. However, there's much more to it. You can pause the game and map out a path for Red to run along, measuring out your attacks along the way. When you're paused, you can only run so far and take so many actions. Once you've decided on a path, the game unpauses, and you go through those motions really, really quickly. After this happens, you have to spend a little bit of time recharging. And during this recharging period, your attacks are not going to work, so you have to find shelter. All this begs the question, what are you going to do? You could attack the machines head-on, running and bashing and such, but what happens to Red by the end of this? Is she out in danger, in the open? You could run, hit, and run again, but will you do enough damage? By introducing this pause and play element, Supergiant Games took what would have been otherwise a good ARPG and made it into a great game. It's through this additional layer of strategy that Transistor manages to stand out from the pack. Then again, the game's fantastic writing, going anyway. Okay, you get the point. It's a good game. But getting back on topic, what can other games learn from Transistor's deliberacy? Well, if you're a game developer, consider what elements of your game aren't interactive. Can a cutscene be made interactive without hurting the flow of the game? Interactivity doesn't always mean complex mechanics bloating an otherwise normal gaming experience. It simply means handing some control over an element to players. If players can be handed agency, and if they can see the effects of their agency, even if it's in small ways on a linear path, their actions will feel more meaningful, and subsequently, deliberate. If you're building an ARPG, consider your core gameplay loop. Are players just running in and hitting things? Running around and hitting stuff isn't inherently bad. That said, you could be, and should be, pushing your players to make more meaningful decisions through gameplay. Perhaps you can do this by introducing an element that requires players to strategize carefully. While we're talking about strategy, we move on to our next point. Strong element of risk and reward. Much like the previous title from Supergiant Games, Bastion, it's possible to put limits on oneself as a player within Transistor. There are modifiers called limiters that will reduce players' strength and buff enemies, making the game harder. If you accept these, you'll receive a bonus to your experience points. That's probably the simplest way that Transistor balances risk and reward, and part of what makes it so impressive is that it ties back into the player agency we talked about earlier. You even have the option to disable these limiters if you lose a battle. You can keep trying to beat the game with these extra challenges enabled, but if you're just trying to make it through the story, you can disable these limiters, at least for the boss battle that's giving you trouble. While this isn't a new concept for Supergiant, as they'd put a similar concept to work in their previous game, Bastion, it's an idea that works quite well in Transistor. Then too, there's the duality of the gameplay in the two different modes. If you want, you can mostly ignore the tactical mode that lets you plan your moves out ahead of time, but this is extremely risky with the young ladies. Young ladies, in case you're out of the loop, are a very dangerous sort of robot in Transistor. That said, using the tactical mode comes with its own set of risks. It has a bit of a cooldown, meaning that if you use it to run into a battle, and then somehow strand yourself in an area without cover, you're at risk of a proper whooping since all your attacks are recharging. If you're a game designer, consider where player rewards come from. Is it from taking actions that continue to challenge and engage players? Are risks rewarded? There's more than one way to reward a risk. As mentioned before, Transistor allows players to scale the strengths of enemies alongside the weaknesses of a player character to raise their challenge level. So instead of just offering easy, medium, and hard modes in your own game, why not give players the chance to decide just how hard individual elements of the game will be? Then too, there should be risk involved in exploration. Back when Minecraft had a stronger sense of direction, the game's survival mode was interesting because it was largely about exploration. Sure, there were resources around, but obtaining them wasn't the easiest thing in the game. As time went on, however, Minecraft became substantially less challenging and engaging early on to players. Whether this is due to players learning the game or because of updates bringing a load of features is up for debate, but one thing is clear. That game's not as engaging as it used to be because exploration isn't as risky as it once was. If you associate a challenge and the actual risk of loss with pushing outside of the comfort zone, you'll better engage your players. Room to breathe. One of my favorite storytelling principles is the notion of ma, or emptiness. Essentially, at certain points, a story is given some space in which it seems as though nothing is happening. Director Hayao Miyazaki is often cited as being a master of this principle. It's often seen at work in his animated films which, while action-packed, also have a lot of downtime. The idea of ma can work wonders for the pacing of a movie, but what about a video game? Games are, after all, an interactive medium. It's thus expected that you'd always be doing something to advance either the story's plot or your own score. Right? Well, Transistor subverts this idea wonderfully in a few different ways. There are the smaller touches, such as the sometimes pointless little statistics on most of the interactive objects, and you'll see them in the computer terminals that are scattered around the game. When you interact with these terminals, everything pauses, and you're invited to vote for game shows you'll never see, and participate in petitions to save a world that's already ended. Then too is the flourish button. Essentially, there's a button dedicated to a specific movement that confers no advantage in combat, nor does it have any other purpose in the gameplay. It's just to do a fun little jump, maybe through a field of mushrooms that have inexplicably sprung up on the otherwise sterile city streets. The game's best-known use of ma, however, is its humming feature. You see, for every song in the game, there's a version of that song that's hummed. At any point outside of combat, you can stop and hum for as long as you wish. There's no practical use for this. It doesn't drive the story forward outside of a brief moment that introduces a cutscene. It doesn't affect gameplay. It's just interactive ma. There are also the backdoors scattered through the game that lead to a happy sunset place. That's what I call it anyway. It's a lounge through which you can access a few time trial levels at your leisure, or perhaps just chill out, listening to your bodyguard turn sword, explaining your situation.
Process. I thought it only wanted you. It wants the whole town.
What Transistor recognizes is that time to relax is also time for world building. The game's moments of ma are often filled with bits of exposition, but they never feel intrusive. They're optional without being auxiliary. Everything fits together nicely, and you can explore this world and its characters as much or as little as you want. What do other games stand to learn from this? Well, sometimes it's best to give players room to breathe. Don't force this on players. This whole idea of Ma in a video game is in allowing players to enjoy the game and its world at their own pace. If you're a game designer, can you find moments where it would be appropriate to let players pick their own pace? I'm not saying that every game needs as much Ma as Transistor, or even a hum button, though that would be nice for some of the Mario games, but maybe more quiet moments that show off character, or are simply used for non-expository world-building, can work to your benefit, grounding players in the world of the game and making moments of action all the more meaningful. Maybe you could even consider adding systems for the sake of Ma. Transistor did it with Flourish button and their happy sunset place.
Not that I know anymore. Help yourself and good.
Well conveyed fee.
Locked yourself
Back
out.
in 2016, I spoke to Amir Rao, studio director at Supergiant Games, regarding Pyre. That game came out July 2017. During the interview, I mentioned something that stuck out to me about Supergiant's games. I've noticed that hope, redemption, and apocalypse all seem to be themes that run throughout your games. Is this intentional?
I mean, I think with our games, you can sort of tell that they're made by the same team, and so we try to design our games around the preoccupations of the people here. We don't like have a game idea and we chase it and see if we can execute it or not. You know, we try and combine the interests of the people here and the ideas that they have currently, and we pull them together into something that's, you know, hopefully thematically rich and has a lot of stuff that you can think about both on the gameplay side, the narrative side, the art and the music, and everything else. So if it feels like something from us, I don't think we could ever escape that because it's being made by the same people who made Bastion and the same people who made Transistor. Our whole team is working on this again.
Very cool. Now, I noticed it's worth noting that at the heart of Bastion, you're experiencing a story about rebuilding a society with a new foundation of forgiveness, depending, of course, on what route you take in the game. In Pyre, you've been exiled to a mysterious underworld to play a high-stakes game of soccer for your freedom. In Transistor, you're a singer who lost her voice to a shady organization that's unleashed a digital plague upon a cyberpunk city, and while I would really rather not spoil the ending, I will say that it involves a theme that seems to be at the heart of Supergiant's games: new beginnings. To hit that house flavor at the end, however, Transistor needed to work with Supergiant's other main themes: apocalypse and hope. The first part sounds simple enough to anybody who's seen a superhero movie in the last decade, or perhaps to fans of Hideaki Anno. You end the world, make the whole thing come tumbling down, and boom, apocalypse, right? Sure. Technically, but not necessarily thematically. The word apocalypse comes from the Greek apocalypsis, which, directly translated, means after I cover, or revelation, a revealing. We so often associate the term apocalypse with cataclysmic events, but it's more than that. It involves the revealing, not just of impending doom, but of the structures which are condemned to destruction. As you roam the empty streets of Cloudbank, you clearly see what the city was to its inhabitants: a beautiful, very commercial, democratically oriented society wherein the populace took no note of the camerata until the process swept them away. The revealing and destruction seem to be happening at the same time. Pieces of story and character are revealed, for instance, as you upgrade the Transistor with the data that's left over from processed citizens. Their destruction brings new lore and character bios to read in between upgrades, upgrades that increase the player's own destructive capability. Hence, you embody the theme while interacting with all of its possible meanings. So, where does hope come into play? Well, there's your companion. Your bodyguard trapped in the titular Transistor is clearly saddened by what's happened to Cloudbank, and yet he's always keeping his chin up. Metaphorically, of course, because swords don't have chins. Then, too, while Red is a silent protagonist, it doesn't mean that she has no lines. She'll occasionally type her thoughts into the computer terminals that are scattered across Cloudbank as comments on articles that nobody's gonna read. Additionally, some of the songs that play in the background feature lyrics, sung by the fantastically talented Ashley Barrett, and these lyrics relate directly to what's happening in the story. Superlatively, it's through the interactions between Red and the Transistor, Red's actions and Transistor's reactions, that we get a sense of their relationship. A love story at the end of a world. Hope, in the face of despair. It's through the expressions of its characters, limited as these may be, that Transistor expresses the hope that ultimately makes the redemption at the end of the story meaningful. For the sake of our viewers who have not played the game, I'm not going to say what exactly this is, but it is relatively self-explanatory in my opinion why it works so well. So, what do other games stand to learn from the way that Transistor conveys its themes? Well, Transistor has a decent set of ideas and sticks to them. Not to go all obscure theory, but those themes seem to be what Supergiant excels at. If you're writing a game story, ask yourself what your themes and central ideas seem to be. Don't get too lost in looking for a theme, however. Mr. Rao, when I asked him about the themes that ran through his studios for games, pretty much told me that they'd just been writing what they were feeling. So, find your theme, and work at ways to reinforce it, but don't smack the audience over the head with your ideas. Weave them into the world and story and characters and circumstances, but don't haphazardly throw them atop your game's story. Imagine if, instead of using nuance and world building and character to convey its themes, Transistor straight up told players with a series of lengthy cutscenes that the Mafia created terrible apocalypse-inducing machines, and that you're in love with your boyfriend who's now a talking, glowing cybersword, and that you have a superfan who's totally ready to duel you to the death, and a dude named Royce is... well, you get the picture. Don't try to feed the audience your theme with a shovel. Leave pieces of theme lying around and let the players put together the pieces. This has been Other Games Can Learn From. What do you think of the show? Are we right about Transistor and all that it stands to teach other games? Was there something you'd like to add? Hit us up on Twitter at OneRuleBeCool and let us know. If you'd like to support the show, you can do so at patreon.com/OneRuleBeCool. Thank you for watching, and be sure to keep learning. Stick around for afterthoughts after this brief word from our sponsors. There are more tools to make games, and games being released, than ever before. How do you get your game noticed by sites, streamers, and other outlets? Playing the Press is your guide to standing up and standing out. 90% of dentists surveyed recommend your toothpaste. 100% of game devs surveyed recommend Playing the Press. Don't just take my word for it. Here's what the developers have to say.
Since I'm very new to the industry, it's a good primer for just getting a basic understanding of how to contact the press, how to speak to them.
Any advice from the book that you would definitely want to pass on to other devs?
No, not necessarily. Just read the book. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. It gets right to the point.
Get it on Amazon and itch.io today. Afterthoughts. Naming the mob the Camerata was a pretty clever move. A camerata is a chamber orchestra or choir, and it was the Florentine camerata of the 16th century that combined drama and music to create opera. Transistor feels like a tragic cyberpunk opera in terms of theme and tone. A mafia of musicians fits this very well. While we're talking about music, so many of the lyrics in the soundtrack relate to the game thematically. The story is right there in the music. Is Transistor the video game equivalent of a Broadway musical? I don't think so, but I do think that it comes close. Perhaps if the gameplay related more to the music, and humming was more than just a side mechanic for the sake of Ma, it totally could have been. Then again, maybe it's a musical if you play it that way. Just my thoughts, really.